I will never forget the look on Victoria's face when Dr. Lawson held up that pill bottle in the fluorescent hospital light, how the color drained from her cheeks like water running from a broken vase. My heart monitor was still beeping its frantic rhythm behind me, tubes in my arms, the metallic taste of fear still coating my tongue from nearly dying just hours before. The doctor's hands were steady as he opened one of my capsules right there in front of my son and his wife, showing us how someone had carefully split each extended-release pill in half, turning my carefully calibrated heart medication into something dangerous, something that could kill me. Victoria's lips parted but no sound came out, and in that terrible silence, I understood that my own daughter-in-law had been willing to let me die to save a few dollars. You know, they say you never truly know what you're capable of surviving until you're forced to survive it. I am Margaret Thompson, 68 years old now, and I have learned this truth the hardest way possible. For 3 years I watched my own home become a prison, my own family become strangers, and my own body betray me in ways I could not understand. But I am getting ahead of myself, and you deserve to hear this story from the beginning, the way it actually happened, piece by painful piece. It started simply enough, the way most betrayals do. My Richard came to my door 3 years ago with Victoria on his arm, both of them looking tired and a little desperate in that way young couples sometimes do when life has not turned out quite as planned. They needed a place to stay just for a couple of months, maybe 3 at most, while they saved up for a down payment on their own home. Richard had lost his job in the city, and Victoria's freelance graphic design work was not bringing in enough yet. What kind of mother says no to her only child when he needs help? I was a widow by then, had been for 7 years since my Harold passed from cancer. The house felt too big for just me anyway. That modest 2-bedroom suburban home where we had raised Richard, where I had planned to grow old surrounded by memories and maybe, if I was blessed, grandchildren someday. I still remember how Victoria smiled when I showed them the guest room, how she thanked me with what seemed like genuine warmth. I wanted so badly to believe we would become family, that I would finally have a daughter to share recipes with, to laugh with over morning coffee. The first month was pleasant, almost harmonious. Victoria cooked dinner twice a week, and Richard helped me fix the loose board on the back porch that had been bothering me since winter. We watched television together in the evenings, and I began to feel less lonely, less like I was simply waiting for time to pass in an empty house. I did not see the warning signs then, or perhaps I did not want to see them. It began with small things, so small I told myself I was being oversensitive, that I should be grateful for help rather than suspicious of change. Victoria reorganized my kitchen one Saturday while I was at church, moving everything to new cabinets, throwing away my old but perfectly good mixing bowls because they did not match her aesthetic. She said she was trying to help, trying to modernize things, and I swallowed my discomfort because I did not want to seem difficult or old-fashioned. The next week, my lace curtains disappeared from the living room, replaced with stark gray blinds. Then my collection of clay pots that I had used for my indoor herbs, gone, thrown away because Victoria found them cluttered and dated. Each loss felt like a small death, but I said nothing. I told myself these were just things, that family harmony was more important than objects. I did not yet understand that Victoria was not rearranging my home but erasing me from it, piece by piece. The photographs came down next from the hallway walls. 40 years of memories, my wedding day, Richard's childhood, Harold's warm smile. All packed away into boxes and shoved into the basement because Victoria wanted the walls painted a trendy shade of gray. I found myself crying that night in my bedroom, feeling foolish for being so sentimental about pictures, but something deep inside me was beginning to break. Then came the day Victoria knocked on my bedroom door and explained, in that calm, reasonable voice of hers, that she and Richard really needed the master bedroom. It had better closet space for Richard's work clothes, she said, and the attached bathroom would be more convenient for them. She had already picked out which room I would move into, the small maid's room on the first floor that my grandmother had used when she lived with us briefly before she passed. It was barely bigger than a closet, with no windows, no natural light, just 4 walls and a sense of being buried alive. Richard said nothing when I looked to him for support. He simply looked away, and in that moment of his silence, I understood that I had already lost my son to this woman. I moved my things into that dark little room and tried to convince myself it was temporary, that they would move out soon as promised. But the months stretched on and the rules multiplied. I could only use the washing machine on Tuesdays and Fridays. I could not cook my own meals during Victoria's meal prep times. which seemed to expand to cover most of the day. My television time was limited because Victoria needed quiet for her work. My modest pension check, which arrived faithfully each month, $1,800 that I had earned through 40 years of work as a school secretary, Victoria decided half of it should go toward household expenses. Rent, she called it. Rent in my own home. I was too stunned, too conditioned by then to silence and compliance to argue. I paid her $900 a month and tried to survive on what remained. Food, utilities, medication, it all had to come from that shrinking pile of money. I stopped buying small luxuries. I stopped going to the hair salon. I stopped replacing worn-out clothes. I became smaller and smaller, both physically and spiritually, shrinking into the corners of my own life. And then my heart started to fail, though I did not know yet that Victoria's hand was behind that too. The chest pain started 6 months after I moved into that windowless room, though I did not connect the two at first. How could I know that stress and heartbreak could manifest as physical symptoms, that emotional suffocation could translate into actual breathlessness? I would wake in the night with my heart racing, hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I would lie there in the darkness wondering if this was how I would die, alone in a room that felt like a tomb, in a house that no longer felt like home. I told myself it was just anxiety, just the natural process of getting older. My Harold had died of a weak heart, and perhaps this was simply my genetic inheritance catching up with me. I did not mention it to Richard or Victoria for weeks because I had learned by then that my problems were burdens to them, inconveniences they tolerated with barely concealed impatience. Victoria had a way of sighing when I spoke, a particular tightening around her eyes that made me feel like I was taking up too much space simply by existing. But the episodes grew worse, more frequent. I would be folding laundry, my laundry done on my assigned Tuesday, and suddenly the room would tilt, my vision would blur, and I would have to grip the edge of the washing machine to keep from falling. My pulse would skitter and jump, too fast and then too slow, following no rhythm that made sense. Once, I collapsed in the kitchen while making myself a simple sandwich during my permitted lunch hour. I came to on the cold linoleum floor, Victoria standing over me with her phone in her hand, asking if she really needed to call an ambulance or if I could just pull myself together. I pulled myself together. I always did. Eventually, though, even my stubborn pride could not ignore what was happening. I made an appointment with Dr. Lawson, my physician of 20 years, the man who had seen me through Harold's illness and my own grief. He listened to my heart with that serious expression doctors get when they hear something concerning, and he ordered tests, electrocardiograms, blood work, a Holter monitor that I wore for 48 hours, recording every irregular beat. The diagnosis was cardiac arrhythmia, a condition where the heart's electrical system misfires, causing it to beat too quickly, too slowly, or erratically. It was serious but manageable with medication, Dr. Lawson explained. He wrote me a prescription for extended-release capsules, carefully formulated to keep my heart rhythm steady throughout the day. The pills were expensive, $600 a month, and when I saw that price at the pharmacy, I actually felt faint again. I had exactly $900 to live on each month after Victoria took her share. $600 for medication left me with $300 for food, phone, personal items, and the small prescriptions I needed for my arthritis and blood pressure. I did the math standing there in the pharmacy aisle, my hands shaking as I held the pill bottle. I would have to cut back even more. No more fresh fruit. No more occasional treats. Rice and beans and whatever was on the deepest discount shelf. I paid for the medication and went home feeling like I was drowning in slow motion. Victoria noticed the pill bottle on the kitchen counter the next morning. I watched her pick it up, read the label, and something crossed her face. Not concern for my health, but irritation at the expense. She asked how much it cost, and when I told her, she set the bottle down hard enough that I flinched. She said nothing else, but I could feel her anger filling the room like smoke, and I found myself apologizing for being sick, for needing medication to stay alive. I took those pills faithfully, exactly as prescribed. 1 capsule every morning with food, the extended-release formula designed to maintain a steady level in my bloodstream throughout the day. For the first 2 weeks, I felt better. The racing stopped, the dizzy spells lessened, and I began to hope that maybe this was the answer, that I could manage this condition and continue my quiet existence without causing too much trouble. But then something changed. The symptoms returned, but differently this time. Violent swings between feeling my heart race frantically and then barely beat at all. I would have periods of near-normal rhythm followed by terrifying episodes where I thought my heart might simply stop. I could not understand what was happening. I was taking my medication exactly as directed, never missing a dose, but my body seemed to be revolting against me anyway. I went back to Dr. Lawson, confused and frightened. He checked my prescription, verified I was taking the correct dosage, and seemed puzzled by my worsening condition. He adjusted my dose, thinking perhaps I needed more medication, but that only made things worse. I started having attacks 2 or 3 times a week, each one leaving me weaker, more exhausted, more certain that my body was giving up. What I did not know, what I could not have known, was that Victoria had been doing something to my pills. I kept them in my room, in the drawer of my small nightstand, and I never thought to question whether they had been tampered with. Why would I? Who could imagine that someone would deliberately sabotage life-saving medication? But Victoria had found a way to stretch that $600 prescription. While I was at church on Sundays, or during my limited time out of the house for grocery shopping, she would slip into my room and carefully open my pill capsules. Extended-release medications work because the medicine is contained in tiny beads or layers that dissolve slowly over many hours. By splitting each capsule in half, Victoria was destroying that careful formulation, creating dangerous spikes when I took the partial dose and then dangerous drops as it wore off too quickly. She was trying to make my medication last twice as long to cut the monthly cost in half. She was, in her mind, being frugal and practical. She did not care, or perhaps did not understand, that she was slowly killing me with each split pill. I remember one night in particular, about a month before everything finally came to light. I woke at 3 in the morning with my heart hammering so violently I could hear it in my ears, see my chest jumping with each beat. I stumbled out of my little room, desperate for help, and knocked on what used to be my bedroom door. Richard opened it, groggy and confused, and I tried to explain that something was terribly wrong, that I needed to go to the hospital. Victoria appeared behind him, and I will never forget the look on her face. Not concern, not compassion, but annoyance at being disturbed. She told Richard it was probably just a panic attack, that I was being dramatic, that old people often got worked up over nothing in the middle of the night. And Richard, my son, my only child, simply nodded and told me to try to calm down and go back to bed. I stood there in the hallway, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest, and I understood with devastating clarity that I was completely alone. If I died in that little room, it might be hours or days before anyone even checked on me. I turned and walked back to my tomb, and I waited for morning, certain each breath might be my last. But I survived that night and the next and the next. I did not know then that survival itself would become my greatest act of resistance. The attack that nearly killed me happened on a Tuesday evening in late September. One of those beautiful autumn nights when the air turns crisp and the sky fades to deep purple just after sunset. I remember thinking how strange it was that the world could be so lovely while I was dying, that somewhere people were enjoying the weather while my heart was tearing itself apart in my chest. I had taken my evening medication as usual, never suspecting that the capsule in my hand had been altered, that Victoria had been in my room earlier that day doing her careful, deadly work. The symptoms hit within an hour, not the usual racing or skipping, but something far more terrifying. My heart began to beat in a pattern that made no sense, lurching and stuttering like an engine trying to start on a frozen morning. The room spun violently, and I could not catch my breath no matter how hard I tried. I managed to get to my feet, clinging to the wall as I made my way toward the living room where Richard and Victoria were watching television. Each step felt like walking through deep water, my legs weak and uncooperative, my vision tunneling to a single point of light. I must have made some sound because Richard looked up just as I collapsed onto the carpet, my body refusing to obey any command my brain sent. This time, even Victoria could not dismiss what was happening. My lips had turned blue, Richard told me later, and my breathing was so shallow he thought I had already died. He called 911 while Victoria stood frozen, her face pale but unreadable in that way she had perfected. The ambulance arrived within 7 minutes, though it felt like hours to me, trapped in a body that had become a malfunctioning machine. The paramedics worked quickly, attaching monitors, inserting in 4, asking questions I could barely answer. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, kept telling me to stay with her, to keep breathing, and I focused on her voice like it was a rope pulling me back from a dark edge I had been slipping over. They loaded me into the ambulance, and I caught a glimpse of Richard's terrified face and Victoria's carefully blank one before the doors closed and the sirens began their wail. The emergency room was a blur of bright lights and urgent voices, and the steady beep of machines tracking my failing heart. They gave me medication to try to restore normal rhythm, and slowly, painfully, my heart began to settle into something less chaotic. I spent 4 hours in the ER before they moved me to a cardiac unit for observation, and it was there, in a quiet room at 2 in the morning, that Dr. Lawson arrived even though he was not on call that night. He had been contacted by the ER physician, and something about my case had troubled him enough to come in personally. He sat beside my bed and asked me to tell him exactly how I had been taking my medication, what time of day, with food or without, whether I had missed any doses. I explained everything as clearly as my exhausted mind would allow, and I saw something shift in his expression, not confusion anymore but suspicion. He asked if he could see my pill bottle, and I told him it was at home in my nightstand drawer. He made a phone call, and 20 minutes later Richard arrived with the bottle, Victoria trailing behind him with that same blank expression that I was beginning to recognize as her shield against accountability. Dr. Lawson took the bottle and excused himself, and I watched through my door as he went to the nurse's station and opened several of my capsules under the bright desk lamp. What happened next I learned later, after everything had been explained and examined and documented. Dr. Lawson found that every single capsule in my bottle had been carefully opened and split in half, the medication divided and the capsules resealed. Some of them were not even resealed properly. He could see where the two halves did not quite line up. It was amateur work, done by someone who understood nothing about pharmacology or extended-release formulations, someone who saw only dollar signs and convenience. He came back into my room with Richard and Victoria, his face set in that professional mask doctors wear when they have to deliver devastating news. He held up one of the opened capsules and explained what he had found, his voice steady but cold in a way I had never heard from him before. Someone had been tampering with my medication, he said, destroying the extended-release mechanism, and creating dangerous spikes and drops in my blood levels. The cardiac events I had been experiencing, the near-death episode tonight, they were not natural progression of my disease but the direct result of this tampering. Someone had been poisoning me, slowly and methodically, whether through ignorance or malice. The room went silent in that terrible way that happens when a truth too large to comprehend fills all the available space. I looked at Victoria, and for the first time in 3 years I saw past her careful mask to what lived beneath. Not evil exactly, but a hollowness where empathy should have been. A cold calculation that valued money and convenience over human life. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and I watched the color drain from her face like someone had opened a tap. She tried to speak, to deflect, to explain, but the words came out wrong, tangled, and defensive. She said something about trying to help, about making the medication last longer, about not realizing it would cause harm. Dr. Lawson cut her off, his voice sharp now, asking if she understood that she had nearly killed me, that what she had done was not just dangerous but potentially criminal. Richard stood frozen beside her, and I watched my son's face as he finally understood what he had been living with, what he had allowed to happen to his own mother. Victoria's carefully constructed world began to crumble in that hospital room under the fluorescent lights. She tried to grab Richard's hand, but he pulled away from her, and in that gesture I saw the beginning of the end of their marriage. Dr. Lawson left to call hospital security and document everything for what he said would likely be a police investigation. A nurse came in to check my vitals and gave Victoria a look of such pure contempt that even she seemed to feel it. I lay in that hospital bed, tubes still in my arms, my heart finally beating in something close to normal rhythm, and I felt something I had not felt in 3 years, a spark of my old self, the woman who had raised a son and built a life and survived widowhood. I was tired of disappearing, tired of making myself small, tired of dying by inches in my own home. The truth was out now, and there would be no going back to the way things were. For the first time since Victoria had entered my life, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I was not merely surviving but actually living. They kept me in the hospital for 3 days while they stabilized my heart rhythm with proper, untampered medication and ran tests to ensure no permanent damage had been done. Those 3 days gave me something I had not had in years, time alone with my thoughts, space to breathe without Victoria's presence poisoning the air, and visitors who came not out of obligation but genuine concern. My cousin Laura came on the second day, the family lawyer who I had not seen much of since Harold's funeral. She was 10 years younger than me, sharp and practical in that way some women are when life has taught them to be their own protectors. She sat beside my hospital bed and listened to everything: the 3 years of gradual erasure, the financial abuse, the isolation, and finally the medication tampering. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she asked me a question that changed everything. She asked if I wanted my life back. I had thought the answer would be complicated, tangled up in mother's guilt and fear of being alone and the shame of admitting I had let things get so bad. But sitting there in that hospital bed, still weak but alive, the answer was startlingly simple. Yes, I told her. Yes, I want my life back. Laura became my advocate in ways I had not known I needed. She explained that what Victoria had done was not just morally wrong but legally actionable. Elder financial abuse, psychological abuse, and potentially criminal negligence or assault for the medication tampering. The hospital had already filed a mandatory report with Adult Protective Services as required by law. The police would be involved whether I wanted them to be or not. She helped me understand that my house was still mine, that Victoria had no legal right to it, that the rent she had been collecting was likely considered financial exploitation under state law. We could get a restraining order, Laura said. We could force Victoria to leave. We could pursue criminal charges. The power I thought I had lost had never actually left. I had simply been too beaten down to reach for it. Richard came to visit me alone on the third day, and I barely recognized my son in the man who walked through that door. He had always been handsome in that mild way Harold had been, but now he looked hollowed out, aged 10 years in 3 days. He sat in the chair beside my bed and cried, and I had not seen him cry since his father's funeral. He apologized over and over, saying he had been blind, that he had let Victoria convince him I was being dramatic, overly sensitive, difficult in the way old people sometimes become. I wanted to be angry with him, and part of me was, but mostly I felt sad for both of us. He had been manipulated just as I had been, just in different ways. Victoria had isolated him from me as effectively as she had isolated me from my own life, creating a barrier of small lies and twisted interpretations until he could no longer see clearly what was happening in his own mother's house. He told me he was leaving Victoria, that he had already moved to a hotel, that he could not be married to someone capable of such cruelty. He asked if he could help me reclaim the house, if there was anything he could do to make amends. I told him the truth, that I needed time and space, that his relationship with me would have to be rebuilt slowly and carefully, that his first job was to figure out how he had become someone who could stand by while his mother was abused in her own home. Victoria, meanwhile, was unraveling in spectacular fashion. Laura had moved quickly with the restraining order, and by the time I was discharged from the hospital, Victoria had been legally barred from the property and given 48 hours to collect her belongings under police supervision. The items she had thrown away or destroyed could not be replaced, but at least she could no longer destroy anything else. The police investigation revealed things I had not known, things that explained so much about Victoria's desperate need for control and money. She had debts I had never heard about, credit cards maxed out, personal loans defaulted on, a car repossessed before she even met Richard. She had seen my modest home and my small but steady pension as a solution to her financial chaos, and when that was not enough, she had tried to eliminate even the cost of keeping me alive. They found text messages on her phone, conversations with a friend where she complained about me, called me a burden, joked about how much easier life would be when I was gone. They found internet search history about life insurance policies and inheritance laws. The prosecutor told Laura they had enough evidence to charge Victoria with multiple crimes, including endangering the life of a vulnerable adult. I did not feel triumphant hearing this. I felt hollow and sad that it had come to such ugliness, that someone could harbor such darkness toward another human being. But I also felt something else stirring in me, a fierce protectiveness of my own life, a determination that I would not waste whatever time I had left on guilt or false forgiveness. The day Victoria came to collect her things, I was there, standing in my own living room with Laura beside me and 2 police officers present to ensure everything remained peaceful. Victoria could not look at me. She moved through the house grabbing clothes and electronics and personal items, her movements jerky and defensive. She tried once to take things that were mine, a set of dishes, some kitchen equipment, and Laura stopped her with that calm legal authority that made Victoria shrink back. Before she left, Victoria turned to me, and I thought perhaps she would apologize, would show some flicker of remorse or humanity. Instead, she told me I was ruining her life, that I was vindictive and cruel for involving lawyers and police, that she had only been trying to help. Even then, facing the consequences of her own actions, she could not accept responsibility for what she had done. I said nothing to her. I had spent 3 years making myself smaller to accommodate her presence, and I would not give her even one more word of my energy. I simply stood there until she finished gathering her things and left my house for the last time, escorted by officers who made sure she took nothing that did not belong to her. After she was gone, I walked through my house room by room, seeing it with new eyes. It would take time to make it feel like home again, to undo the damage and reclaim the spaces, but for the first time in 3 years, the air felt lighter, easier to breathe. The first night alone in my house after Victoria left, I could not sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because the silence was so profound, so complete, that it felt like a physical presence. I lay in my little windowless room, the one I had not yet moved out of, and listened to the absence of footsteps overhead, the absence of tension crackling through the walls, the absence of that constant vigilance I had maintained for 3 years. It was the silence of safety, and I had forgotten what that felt like. The next morning, I did something I had not done in years. I made myself a proper breakfast in my own kitchen at whatever time I pleased, without checking the clock to see if it was Victoria's meal prep time. I scrambled eggs with royale butter, made toast with jam, brewed coffee strong and dark the way I liked it. I ate slowly at my own kitchen table, and I cried into my eggs because such a simple thing had become an act of reclamation. Laura helped me in those early weeks with the practical matters that felt overwhelming. We changed the locks on all the doors, not because Victoria would dare violate the restraining order, but because I needed to know she no longer had any way to enter my space. We set up a security system with cameras, basic but effective, that gave me peace of mind. We went through the house documenting everything that had been lost or destroyed for the legal case building against Victoria. Some things could not be replaced. The photographs Victoria had packed away were never found. She claimed she threw them out, but I suspected she destroyed them deliberately. My grandmother's hand-crocheted tablecloth, my collection of recipe cards with my mother's handwriting, Harold's favorite reading chair that Victoria had donated without asking, these were gone forever, and I grieved them honestly, allowing myself to feel the loss without minimizing it. But some things could be recovered. I found my father's mahogany rocking chair in a consignment shop 3 towns over, recognized it immediately by the specific pattern of the carving, and the small chip on the left armrest where Richard had hit it with a toy truck when he was 4. The shop owner wanted $200 for it, and I paid without hesitation, crying as I ran my hands over the smooth wood that had held 3 generations of my family. I brought it home and placed it by the window in what was once again my living room, and I sat in it that evening watching the sunset, feeling my father's presence in the gentle creak of the wood. I rescued my lace curtains from the basement where they had been stuffed into a trash bag. They were wrinkled and dusty but intact, and I washed them carefully by hand and hung them back in their rightful place. The afternoon light filtering through them created patterns on the floor that I had missed more than I realized, familiar shadows that meant home. The master bedroom took me weeks to reclaim. I had to paint over Victoria's trendy gray with a warm cream color that made the room feel open and peaceful. I bought new bedding, modest but mine, and I moved my belongings back into the closet and dresser that had been emptied to make room for her things. The first night I slept in my own bed again in my own room, I woke at 3 in the morning and could not remember where I was, so accustomed had I become to that dark little cave downstairs. My health improved steadily on proper medication, the real extended release capsules that I now kept locked in a small safe that only I could access. Dr. Lawson monitored me closely those first months, adjusting dosages as needed, and gradually the terrifying episodes stopped. My heart found its rhythm again, and with it my body remembered how to feel strong. But the deeper healing was harder and took longer. I had to learn how to take up space again, how to make noise without apologizing, how to exist in my own home without constantly calculating whether my presence was an inconvenience to someone else. I had to unlearn the habit of making myself small, and some days I failed at this, catching myself tiptoeing through my own kitchen or feeling guilty for watching television in the middle of the afternoon. Laura came by often in those months, bringing groceries or just sitting with me over coffee, and I began to understand that family was not just blood but choice. She introduced me to a support group for elder abuse survivors, and I attended my first meeting with my heart in my throat, terrified of being judged or pitted. Instead, I found a room full of women who understood, who had their own stories of being erased and exploited and gaslit by people who were supposed to love them. There was Dorothy, whose daughter had stolen her identity and opened credit cards in her name. There was Helen, whose son's gambling addiction had nearly cost her the home she had lived in for 50 years. There was Marie, whose grandson had moved in to help her after surgery and then refused to leave, turning her into a prisoner in her own house. We were a circle of survivors, and in sharing our stories we gave each other permission to be angry, to grieve, and eventually to heal. I began volunteering at the local senior center, helping other older women navigate the legal system when they faced abuse or exploitation. Laura taught me the basics of what to look for, what questions to ask, and I discovered I had a gift for listening without judgment and holding space for pain without trying to fix it too quickly. I could not save everyone, but I could be a witness to their suffering, and sometimes that was enough to help them save themselves. Richard and I were finding our way back to each other slowly, carefully, with boundaries that had not existed before. He came for dinner once a month and we talked about safe things at first, the weather, books we were reading, memories of Harold that did not hurt too much to revisit. He was in therapy, working through his own guilt and his patterns of avoidance, and I respected that he was doing the work even though it could not undo what had happened. His divorce from Victoria was progressing through the courts, messy and bitter, and I stayed carefully distant from it. That was his path to walk, and I had my own healing to focus on. He never asked me to forgive Victoria or to understand her better, and I appreciated that restraint more than he probably knew. The legal case against Victoria moved forward with the steady inevitability of justice delayed but not denied. The prosecutor was building a comprehensive case documenting, not just the medication tampering, but the pattern of financial and psychological abuse. Laura kept me informed but protected me from having to engage directly when I was not ready. I planted a small garden that spring in my backyard, something I had not done since Harold died. Tomatoes and herbs and flowers, simple and manageable but alive, growing, reaching toward the sun. I would sit on my back step in the early mornings with my coffee, watching the light change and listening to the birds, and I would feel something very close to contentment. I am sitting in my father's mahogany rocking chair on a Tuesday morning in late spring, almost exactly 1 year since the night I nearly died, and I am drinking cinnamon coffee from my favorite china cup, the one with tiny roses around the rim that Victoria once called outdated and sentimental. The morning light filters through my lace curtains, creating patterns on the hardwood floor that I had forgotten existed, and I am thinking about how strange and miraculous it is to be alive, to be here, to be free. Victoria left the country 6 months ago, fleeing before her trial could begin. The prosecutor called it an admission of guilt, Laura called it cowardice, but I called it irrelevant. She took what little money she had left and disappeared to somewhere far away where extradition would be difficult, leaving behind a trail of debts and burned bridges and people she had used and discarded. Her own family wanted nothing to do with her. Her friends, the few she had, refused to speak her name. She had constructed her own prison out of lies and cruelty, and she would carry it with her wherever she went. People asked if I was angry that she escaped justice, but they did not understand what I had come to know in my bones. Justice was not a courtroom or a sentence or watching someone suffer. Justice was me, sitting in this chair, alive and whole and reclaiming my existence one quiet morning at a time. Justice was Victoria running for the rest of her life while I finally stood still in peace. Richard comes to see me every other Sunday now, and we have dinner together at my kitchen table like civilized people finding their way back to something that might eventually resemble family. He is in therapy still, working through his guilt and his patterns of looking away when looking was required, and I respect the work he is doing even if it cannot undo what happened. We do not talk about Victoria unless necessary. She is a scar we both carry, and scars do not need constant examination to prove they exist. He brought me flowers last Sunday, simple daisies from the grocery store, and he said he was sorry again. Not the frantic, desperate apologies of those first weeks, but something quieter and more genuine. I told him what I have told him before, that I am working toward forgiveness but I am not there yet, that healing takes the time it takes and cannot be rushed. He nodded and did not push, and in that restraint I saw growth. The legal case closed without a trial, marked in official records as defendant absconded, and left open should Victoria ever return. The hospital kept my records documenting the medication tampering. The police kept their evidence of financial exploitation and psychological abuse. If she ever came back, everything would be waiting. But I did not spend my days hoping for her return or imagining confrontations. I spent them living. My house is mine again in every way that matters. I painted the walls colors that make me happy. Soft blues and warm creams and a sunny yellow in the kitchen that makes every morning feel brighter. I rescued what I could and released what was lost, understanding finally that objects carry memory, but they are not memory itself. My father's rocking chair, my lace curtains, the clay pots I found at an estate sale to replace the ones Victoria threw away. These are symbols of reclamation, but the real reclamation happened inside me. The women from my support group have become my family in ways blood relatives never managed. We meet every Thursday evening at the community center, and afterward we go for coffee or sometimes just sit in someone's living room talking about everything and nothing. Dorothy and Helen and Marie and 6 others whose stories are written in the same language of survival and strength. We celebrate victories, a grandson moving out, a daughter finally understanding boundaries, a pension check deposited into the right account for the first time in years. We hold each other through setbacks and difficult days and moments when the old fear tries to creep back in. I volunteer 3 mornings a week now at the senior center, helping other women navigate the systems that failed to protect them, teaching them the words for what happened to them, showing them they are not crazy or difficult or too sensitive. I share my story when it helps, and I stay quiet when listening is what is needed. Some of them go on to reclaim their lives the way I did. Some are not ready yet, and I honor that too. Healing moves at its own pace. My garden is thriving, tomatoes heavy on the vine and herbs growing thick and fragrant in their clay pots. I sit on my back step most evenings watching the sunset, my hands in the dirt, my heart beating steady in my chest. The medication works properly now, kept locked in a small safe only I can access, and my body has remembered how to be strong. I walk 2 miles every morning through my neighborhood, greeting neighbors who smile and wave, existing fully in space I no longer apologize for occupying. Last month I turned 69, and I had a party in my backyard with 20 people I chose to be there. Richard came and brought the photo album he had painstakingly reconstructed, finding copies of pictures I thought were lost forever. My wedding day, Harold's warm smile, Richard's childhood, my parents young and hopeful. I cried looking through it, but they were good tears, cleansing tears, the kind that water new growth. Every morning I wake in my own bed in my own room, and the first thing I do is notice the window, the light, the space. I do not take these things for granted anymore. I make my coffee with ceremony, adding cinnamon the way my mother taught me, and I carry it to this rocking chair where I sit and rock and exist. I am 69 years old and I almost disappeared. Someone tried to erase me from my own life, and for a while I let her. But then I remembered who I was before I learned to make myself small, and I decided that woman deserved to exist again, to take up space, to breathe deeply and live loudly. The chair creaks beneath me, a sound that means home and safety and continuation. Outside my window, the world is waking up to another ordinary, miraculous day. My heart beats steady in my chest, and I am here fully present, refusing to vanish. This is my victory. Not revenge, not vindication, but this, sitting in my father's chair, drinking coffee in my own kitchen, watching light filter through curtains I chose, in a house that is finally completely mine. I survived. I healed. I reclaimed myself. And that, I have learned, is everything.